Hi everyone, just comparing Warcraft 3 beta, which released in January 2002, prior to its release in July 2002, to the Stormgate Early Access. I know those two things aren't necessarily one-to-one, as game development has changed in the 17 years since this came out. But we're going to take a look here. So the original Warcraft 3 beta, this is like a reconnect to it, really, using a beta crack. And when it originally came out, it's actually a multiplayer designed for Battle.net. There is like a campaign beta, I believe, but about 5,000 multiplayer beta keys were sent out, and this is kind of what it looked like. So the menus are a little different, but for the most part, it's just a limited map pool with all 4 races. You did have no real AI, no computer, and this guy who tries to recreate and reconnect to this. Obviously, there's no multiplayer for him, but back when we had it, it was multiplayer. So we're going to go and take a look at how things were different. We had some basic campaign. You could only play Orc in the campaign, I believe, and there was just like a couple of missions. And for multiplayer, you had all 4 races, and they were not completed. They weren't fully fleshed out. We did have our heroes. We had quite a few things. But you'll notice right off the bat, if you have any familiarity with Night Elf, is that they don't have to put wisps in their gold mine to mine. This is one of the critical foundations of Night Elf economy was not figured out 6 months prior to the game releasing. 6 months prior, and a key core mechanic was not figured out for Night Elf, one of the 4 races. So the balance already we know is out of whack, but it goes well beyond that. So I'm going to take a list of beta changes for Warcraft 3, and if you have any familiarity with Warcraft 3, you'll kind of see what was different leading up to its release and how much they really changed internally before it came out. So there's only a few maps, as you saw, and the big thing is the race differences, right? So let's get into human. So the Archmage hero, right? He summons a water elemental. During the beta, it doesn't attack air units. It just does splash damage to ground units. Big change. Mountain King hero, Thunderclap stuns instead of slows. Just like Warstomp. Tell me that's not overpowered, right? An AoE stun on Mountain King right out the gate. He did not have Bash, and Avatar just drained mana while active and can be turned off. It was a toggle, and it does not give spell immunity. Paladin's Divine Shield drained mana while active and can be turned off. And Resurrection revives units in a target area instead of around the Paladin. For the Peasants, you could not speed build on human, which is a core mechanic of the race. Like, that race doesn't function without speed build. And 6 months prior to release, they didn't have that in the game. There were no militia as well, which made human extremely weak to rushes 6 months before the game came out. Extremely vulnerable, making them not a viable race, in my opinion. Right? Footman protects against ranged attacks of all types, except for artillery, kind of OP. Priest had Inner Fire as their initiate spell, and Dispel Magic is a single target. Heal was their master level spell, so they could not heal for a while. They were basically like a DPS buff until the late game. The Steam Tank uses a Wrecking Ball to attack structures at melee range and can load up to 4 ground units of any type inside. If you put a Rifleman in, it gains a ranged attack against ground and air units, like a mobile tank unit. Pretty sick, right? Each Rifleman increases the speed of both the Steam Tank's attacks. Workshops can be built as Tier 1 and only requires a blacksmith. Mage towers train priests and sorceresses, and arcane sanctums require a mage tower, enabling sorceresses. Contains upgrades for casters. So you see, like, at a basic level, human was vastly different. Underpowered, had extra layers to getting their units out, had a different tech tree that was less viable, extremely weak to rushes, and you loaded Riflemen into your tank, which actually is pretty strong if you can get there. Weird, right? So, like, human was not figured out 6 months before release. Didn't work, right? What about Orc? You have the Farseer. Doesn't have Feral Spirit. No early game harass. No summoned units. Nothing. Blade Master, mirror image only creates one image, but it was a image that got tankier with each level. Not a big deal. I mean, you just ignore the image, right? Critical Strike always did triple damage, but the chance increased with level. Invulnerable while blade storming. You couldn't kill a blade storming Blade Master. Tauren Chieftain did not have an AoE stun with War Stomp. Has the command aura instead of endurance, which increased damage. Reincarnation has a mana cost. Works the same way as it does in retail, but if his mana is too low, right, when he dies, he will not revive. It also has a different art. Let's take a look at this other beta video here. Peons, the only unit that has pillage, which doesn't need to be researched. Grunt has a Berserker Rage ability that increases attack speed. Headhunters had an upgrade that increases night sight range. It sounds like orcs were just really strong. And I think that's because orcs were probably the first race that they really refined back in Warcraft 3. Kind of like how Vanguard is now in Stormgate. Kodo Beasts require a fortress. They do not attack and they have a mana pool. Instead of War Drums, he had 2 auras, Healing Aura and Speed Aura. So orcs were fast, they were strong, you could rush with them, they required less upgrades. Wyverns did require Wyvern training to unlock, so Air had a little bit of a lock behind it. Shamans were voiced by Chris Metzen. Worth noting. Instead of healing, Witch Doctors had Ancestral Guardian, which is like the kind of similar to the Shadowhunter's Serpent Ward. Tauren, instead of Pulverize, had War Stomp, which functions like a critical strike, not a stun. Orc Burrows attack automatically without needing to load any units into them, so Orc Burrows were essentially towers. You could still load peons into them, but also grunts and headhunters, so you could do a lot more with burrows, and loading units in increases the attack speed. But they didn't provide food. The War Mill was split into 2 buildings, Lumber Mill and Forge. Pig farms provided food instead of orc burrows, so you had extra buildings. And yeah, that was it. So you can see a lot of changes even with like the most refined races. Balance was a huge problem in the beta. And nobody was able to really complain about it. You just kind of gave feedback and you're like, yeah, this is it, you know, and they mostly looked at the BattleNet metrics to balance the game. And it just gets worse and worse with Night Elf and Undead being probably the least refined. You know, Death Knights had no Unholy Aura. Death Pact creates a damage shield instead of restoring life. Intimate Dead raises units in a target area, just like the Resurrection Paladin. The Lich's Frost Nova damages ground units around the Lich instead of targeting a unit, which is underpowered. The Dreadlord, instead of Inferno, has an ability called Dark Summoning, which works like StarCraft 1's Arbiter Recall. Acolytes cannot unsummon buildings originally. You're stuck with what you build. Sacrifice required a research. Gargoyles require the Gargoyle Spire building. And Stone Form cost mana and drains mana while active. Did not give spell immunity. Necromancers had Corpse Explosion from Diablo instead of Cripple. Meat Wagons were trained from crypts and required Halls of the Dead. So you can see like this balance was just not great. Abominations had an upgrade to Explode on Death instead of Disease Cloud. And Frostworm had Freeze Breath on buildings, and it was a manually cast ability. Attack as an artillery weapon type for those as well, so I had an attack ground command for Frostworms. Buildings healed on Blight, and the Hall can return gold, though Acolytes won't do this. This prevent them from being built next to a gold mine. And Tier 2/3 of the main building did not attack. The graveyard contains no research and does not return lumber. Only purpose is to generate corpses. So, like, these races didn't work, is what I'm saying. 6 months before release, Warcraft 3 gameplay was, like, super exciting because it was new and there were 4 races instead of 2 and people were freaking out. But it was very limited in scope. You couldn't do much. Mostly 1v1, and the 1v1s weren't even that good, and that's 6 months before release. Stormgate is at least 1 year from quote-unquote release, and we have our hands on a lot more parts of it than we did with Warcraft 3, and Warcraft 3 became legendary. absolutely legendary. Now, did it have issues with the engine? I think the engine issues were less prevalent. I think there were like some bugs, but it wasn't as big of a deal. There were some performance issues, but not as big of a deal, right? As with Stormgate, mostly they just had a lot of balancing to figure out at the basic level. The game changed tremendously by the time it came out. Tremendously, from creep camp power to the way the races work, the way they generate economy, to the way the units are built and upgraded. All of it changed drastically in a 6-month window. So that is to say that with their limited pool, the lack of campaign that we had access to, the no co-op wasn't a thing back then. You know what I mean? We didn't have all these like fun toys in the toy box to play with, so we just had like 1v1 in campaign pretty much, right? And because of that, those things got very, very well refined in that 6-month window because they weren't spreading their resources over co-op, over esports, over 1v1 competitive, and over, campaign. Instead, it was like pretty much just campaign and 1v1. Custom map builder as well, right? Was a big part of it. So when we compare this old Warcraft 3 to Stormgate, the question I have is, can Stormgate succeed? And I think we're going to see it a little bit differently because the video games industry has evolved over time, and also early access poses new problems that we didn't have then. So first of all, I think that the campaign for Stormgate can absolutely come out swinging still. I think where it is now is like very placeholder, very bare bones, very bad, right? But also, it was kind of that way in Warcraft 3 too. We had like a couple of orc tutorial missions, and that was it, right? Is that a whole lot to work with? It's not. It's not really. Was it indicative of how the campaign ended up being? No, with the amazing camera angles and the quality textures and everything looking really nice and playing really nice and having a compelling story with fun heroes. Absolutely. Stormgate could become that before its release. Absolutely possible. The issue I think that we run into is that we could fix campaign and we could fix 1v1, but look at what else Stormgate is developing. They're developing co-op, and I think co-op is going to take a lot of resources away from refining those things, which doesn't mean it's not going to get good. It means it's going to take too long to get good. Does that make sense? Co-op is a whole nother thing where you're doing these heroes and you're refining their abilities, and they're trying to like double dip a little bit and saying like their 3v3 mode, because they're developing a whole thing around their 3v3 and using heroes in it and stuff. So they're going to try to like use what they learned from co-op, use the abilities they developed and the heroes they developed in co-op for 3v3 and rebalance it. And I think that's going to take a lot of resources away from balancing 1v1 and making sure that the armies and the races are really, really tight, right? And so that's really where we're at. What we're experiencing in Stormgate is two things. One, there's too many toys in the toy box that need high quality development and refinement. We're not focused on campaign. We're not focused on just 1v1. We got campaign, 1v1, co-op, 3v3, and beyond. Stuff that maybe we don't know about what's going on. So that's a lot. That's a lot to take in. It is 3 races instead of 4 races, but the 3 races in like a StarCraft style RTS are arguably more complex than in like a Warcraft 3. We do have the creep camps and their benefits and their balancing, but we had items in Warcraft 3 to balance. You know what I mean? So things are just different, but there's hope because Warcraft 3 was a phenomenal game when it released, and it changed a lot over the years and got better and better and better. And Stormgate has that same possibility because I mean, look at this. Look at this list of like Warcraft 3 beta changes, right? Like, there's a lot of balance changes that just needed to happen for this to be possible, to end up being a good game. Some of these races just lost instantly in certain matchups. You know what I mean? There was a lot of like cheesy builds and a lot of things that just like couldn't be beaten. Doesn't it sound like Stormgate? Like that was the situation of Warcraft 3 only 6 months before release. And while certainly the time to turn that around in 6 months is a lot easier, I would say, or at least not easy, but a lot more possible, a lot more probable, because you're not doing co-op and you're not doing this weird 3v3 specific thing and you're not doing all these like microtransactions and like building these heroes and all this other stuff, you're literally just developing the competitive game and the campaign, right? And then like of course the map builder tools. I think that's where we're at, and that's why Stormgate's reviews are so mixed, is because we we kind of expected more, and I don't know if those expectations were feasible in the time that they've had. And we like to say like it's their budget, it's this, it's that. I think they need more time, and I think they need more focus. They've got everything everywhere. They're trying to do everything to once. When I think what would have worked a lot better is a targeted approach to say we're going to come out with a strong campaign for early access and a strong 1v1. We know that's our core community. We know a lot of people from StarCraft 2 like co-op. Co-op can come later, right? When everything else is kind of refined and working, when we have 2v2 matchmaking and standard 3v3 and standard 4v4, when those things are just working and are good to go, you know what I mean? Then um, we can start talking about the rest of it. So this is just one of those things where Stormgate's in a rough spot. People agree. There's like some really yucky strats and stuff, but like I don't know how many people would have grinded out 700, 800, 900 games of Warcraft 3 ladder back in the beta. That's a lot of games to grind out. A lot of games to grind out. And I just don't think we were playing games on the same level back then that we are now. I don't think that we were um, having the same expectations. And while yes, you can say this is an early access, not a beta, they're very, very similar in terms of where they are on the development cycle. And again, we're seeing the results of spreading out our development resources across way too many game modes, way too many features at the start. StarCraft 2 did not come out with a co-op mode. It wasn't there. They didn't come out with a co-op campaign either, and they're trying to develop that. And I think that's really where we're falling down on our faces here, is that we want to show, like Frost Giant wants to show all the things they can do, but they need to make fewer things that are really, really good, and we will enjoy and love those things for a long time, and that will give them the time to develop those other cool stuff like co-op, etc., etc. So those are my thoughts. Can they turn it around? I think they can, but I think it's going to take way longer than people are willing to wait. But I think it's going to be one of those things where, like, when they do turn it around, everyone's going to look back at them and be like, hold on a second, maybe I need to revisit this. Will it be 1 year? I think it's going to be more than 1 year. I think we're looking at 1.5 years. But that's only because they're spreading their resources too thin. So anyways, thanks for watching. Let me know what you think. This is Nem. I'll see you next time.